The one drop was quickly followed by another, and then many, many more. A rattling began to roar as thick blotches started to clatter down from the ceiling, soon coating everything in the room in a thick, slightly slimy liquid within a fraction of a moment. A few seconds later, the sound of whirring fans erupted along with the hailing of slime, and the room almost immediately cooled down as the air began to move, becoming clearer and clearer as a constant suction quickly vented out the smoke, working so swiftly that the people on the inside could feel a strong wind brush past them. She'd crossed her arms and shivered heavily. Going from basically baking in an oven to being wet and cold basically on a dime really messed with her system, especially since whatever came out of that sprinkler was so much colder than just normal water. But she couldn't deny that being able to breathe without the air scratching up her lungs again was definitely nice. Just as she thought that, she blinked and had to squeeze her lids shut as the room's lights came on in a flicker, stinging her retinas that had gotten so used to the intense darkness at first. She kept her lids squeezed shut for a couple of seconds, before starting to slowly and carefully open them a bit at a time, only seeing schemes and silhouettes at first, as everything was still blurry. Though she noticed that another, gentler blue light had joined up with the room's main lamps, forming a softly glowing rectangle on one of the walls. "Please remain calm. Help is on the way." A familiar voice suddenly came out of the terminal speakers, after the screen had flickered to life. "The safety systems have been reinstated. The doors will unlock shortly after the corridors are no longer deemed as too dangerous to traverse. Medical professionals have been informed and will take care of anyone who needs it. Just hold on a little longer." Gradually getting used to both the cold seeping into her bones and the light stinging into her eyes, Sheeta slowly opened up her stance and took a deep breath through her nose. Even though it was most likely still pretty stale and murky in reality, the air entering her nose now felt like the crispest and freshest she ever breathed, just by comparison to what her lungs had to endure before. It was euphoric, tickling plenty of parts of her brain, as she greedily sucked in breath after breath, while her eyes began to dart around to look at the room. Though, admittedly, the ecstatic mood her brain had been sent into by the timely rescue was slightly dampened as her gaze finally landed on James. By the look of him, he had remained standing bent over his phone or staring down at the screen for quite a while after Aveslon had hung up on him, only now slowly opening up his stance as his mind truly caught up to the fact that his pleas had been heard, as the realized voice filled the room. Still, despite the fact that they had been presumably pulled out of mortal danger, his face had only slightly softened from its earlier intensity. Sheeta could very much still see that boiling lake of wrath and vitriol bubbling just under the surface when she looked into his eyes. Anger and worry had obviously mixed into a rather potent, but also extremely volatile fuel here, and despite the coldness that was left in the room after everything had been extinguished, it seemed to be just waiting for the necessary spark to ignite it. Slowly, Sheeta began to walk up to him in hopes to calm him down a bit. However, just as she did, the phone that was still in his hand began to buzz again. James's eyes snapped down to it. Quickly, he rubbed away some of the viscous fluid that now covered everything, including the screen, until it finally recognized his touch again and allowed him to pick up the call. This time, he put it through to the speakers immediately. "Sorry, I had to concentrate for a moment." Aveslon excused herself, presumably for just hanging up earlier. James's face remained hard, clearly struggling with civil conversation right now, causing Sheeta to jump in his stead. "Don't worry about that. Thank you so much for your help," she said, in genuine gratitude. Her heart was pounding in her chest from stress, but the euphoria that came from surviving this stressful situation was still filling her veins with all kinds of chemicals. "Don't worry about it," Aveslon replied quickly, clearly trying to dismiss the gratitude, even though Sheeta could definitely hear a bit of sheepishness underneath, even as the realized continued. "And also, don't thank me too soon. It seems you were right. These systems were definitely tampered with. And before you ask, sorry, I can't track it." Sheeta's ears hung slightly as she processed that information. It wasn't like she hadn't expected it in some way, but hearing it confirmed was still a bit disheartening. This had been a serious attempt on at least one of their lives. "Do you think you can create a detailed report about the exact kind of tampering instead?" James quickly replied, his brain obviously still in full-on serious business mode. Avesalon paused for a moment, and although she had little reason to believe that, she'd sort of felt it in her bones that the pause was mostly caused by a certain level of irritation at James's tone that they realised was feeling at the time. Still, once she had taken a moment to justifiably pout, she finally spoke up again. "It's not like anyone will believe any evidence that I collected, but I will compile everything I noticed," she said, the annoyance most certainly showing in her voice a bit. And this time, James actually seemed to notice it. Pressing his eyes shut, he released a long breath, his shoulders sinking slightly, as he dropped at least some of the tension they were carrying. Though Sheila could tell that it was a conscious effort to do so, and in no way actual relaxation settling in. "I'm sorry," James said, his face still scrunched up in agitation. Likely not because he didn't actually mean the apology, but because of everything else that was going on. "I'm sorry for yelling, and I'm sorry if I don't seem thankful enough right now. There is a lot going on." It was far from a heartfelt apology. Even Sheila had to admit that. But still, Avesalon seemed to take what she could get. "It's fine," she replied, her tone now becoming far less irritated, turning mostly just serious. "I get that you're angry. I'll unlock the doors in a moment, but be on your guard. The camera systems seem to have been deactivated a bit more permanently, meaning I have no idea what is going on out there, apart from what the fire sensors tell me." James's grimace returned in full force at that information, though he managed to keep his voice under control as he replied, "Thanks for the info, we'll be careful, and take care yourself." Avesalon paused for a moment. Then she finished the conversation by blatantly stating, "You better make it out alive. I still need you to take responsibility for this." Like that, she hung up. James sighed again as the call ended. "Yeah," he said, and nodded to himself, and his voice sounded almost a bit guilty. "I know." As soon as he had gotten that out, the sound of locks unlatching and machinery being set into motion already filled the room, as the lethargic metal groaned while being pulled out of place by its attached controls. Immediately, James hurried through the room with quick steps. He almost slipped on the slimy ground that was still completely covered with whatever extinguishing fluid this was, as he tried to dash across the room, his foot gliding out from under him in a way that had him doing an almost complete split, before he managed to catch himself again and pushed onward with a mild groan of pain. Sheila followed after him after just a moment, once she had realized what he was doing, and she arrived at his side just in time for him to hand her her weapon. He was really planning to be on his guard here. Still, they had to hurry. She threw a quick glance over at their luggage, the reflexive urge to get dressed rearing its head for only a fraction of a second. But not only would their clothes be soaked either way, they also had absolutely no time to waste on modesty. Moore had sounded like she was in really bad shape. They had to get to her fast. Who knew how she was dealing with the sudden cooling down? Therefore, she only quickly inspected her gun for functionality, before looking at James's face and giving him a quick nod. He nodded back at her with that same stern expression, before turning and heading to the door, even if much more careful in his step now, clearly not wishing for a repeat of the earlier slip. Sheila followed after him, quietly, though even as they tried to tread carefully, there was a permanent wet, sloshing sound accompanying each step they took, as their feet pressed down on the fabric covering the floor, thus squeezing out the fluid it had soaked up in the meantime, making a noise akin to that of walking through especially watery mud. And it was really hard to sneak like that. "Let's hope the camera thing doesn't mean anything," the feline thought to herself, as her own ears twitched with each step either of them took, hearing just how far it would carry in a setting like this. And it didn't help her nervous mood at all that they weren't the only ones currently on the move. Of course, that much was obvious. Everyone would want to get out of their rooms right now. But that didn't make the sound of wet footsteps all around any less unnerving, since none of the echoing splotches coming from out in the corridor gave away whether their source was a friend or a foe in the end. Still in the lead, James stopped once he reached the now open door, remaining just far enough within their room to not reveal himself too much to the outside world. After all, they could hear how far the people outside had already gotten while they had been busy preparing, which gave him the opportunity to stop just before he had to assume that anyone would be able to see or take aim at him if he took another step forward. Other steps around him also gradually stopped, leading to a brief moment of a silent stalemate as James and Sheeda tensely stared out at the empty part of the corridor outside that they could actually see, waiting for any sign of what was waiting for them. Luckily, the tense scene didn't last long, as the silence was soon pierced by a new noise. Knocking. One quick knock, followed by 2 slow ones after a brief pause, and then 5 quick ones following immediately after that. The sign. And it sounded like whoever gave it was out in the hall already, meaning there was little risk of stepping out into an unforeseen ambush by a third party. Still, James moved exceptionally carefully as he slowly poked his head out of the door to glance at the knock source, even going so far as to kneel down a bit to make sure his head wouldn't appear where you would expect it to, based on his height. After all, maybe someone could have overheard the sign at some point. Though once his head was past the doorframe's threshold, he almost immediately stood up straight again, indicating that who he saw out there was enough to ease his mind a bit. Lifting his hand, he gave Sheeda a silent sign to follow after him, as he slowly crept out of the room. Sheeda kept her ears open as she complied, tilting them away from the directions that seemed to be safe, to instead listen out for any footsteps that could be coming from less friendly sources, as she followed after the human. So far, everything appeared to be quiet. As she turned the corner through the doorway, the expected group of people was already waiting for them. By the look of it, none of them had taken the time to get dressed either, before gearing up and stepping out, meaning they were in various states of undress as they all came together, ranging from full pajamas to undergarments and nothing more. Despite that, most of them seemed to not be the least bit worried about it, as every soldier's face was hardened into a stern and ready expression, while they nodded at the new arrivals as they joined up. The sole exception here was Nia, whose face still very much had the earlier panic written onto it, even after the very thing that had caused it had been literally extinguished now. Her eyes were wide and her breathing was shallow, as she clasped her arms tightly around her own torso, shivering heavily. Sheeda wasn't sure if it was panic, embarrassment, or simply the cold that led to her current behaviour. Maybe it was a mix of all three. The feline could certainly feel the cold seeping into her own bones more and more the longer she was exposed to the heavy ventilation, or still being drenched in the extremely sticky extinguishing fluid. A rather miserable feeling, really. And with everything that was going on, she couldn't really blame Nia for just wanting to curl up into a ball. However, the sight of the carrying woman also brought the urgent picture of the other civilians with it, causing Sheeda's heart to kick up its pace a couple of gears, as it urged her to try and hurry things along. "Guys, we need to..." she tried to whisper to everyone. However, she was almost immediately silenced by an imperious gesture from Coco, as the commander shushed her with 2 aggressive fingers, reached up in front of her mouth. The woman's green eyes stared into Sheeda's intensely for a couple of seconds, making sure that the message had sunken in, before she slowly allowed her fingers to sink back down. Immediately after, she used the same hand to begin to sign. Not in the usual sign language, but in quick, sharp military gestures that didn't waste a movement as they communicated the commanding officer's orders. "Buddy system. 1 front, 1 back. 2 rows. Prize and civilian in the middle. Mouths closed, eyes open. Go." Sheeda grimaced slightly, but nodded. Even if she had wanted to complain, she knew it would just hold things up at this point. So long as they would get going, whatever was fine by her. Quickly, they began to form up. James had already hurried over to his sister, and was gently encouraging her out of her self-cradling posture, as he carefully put his arms around her. Meanwhile, the others were forming protective lines that would keep an overwatch over the corridor in both directions, everyone covering the back of a specific one of their colleagues. Coco, Admir and Sam were taking the front, while Andrzej, Tuya and, begrudgingly so, Sheeda were covering the rear. Admittedly, the feline would have felt much more comfortable if she was part of the lead here, and could therefore help decide the tempo. But with a quick glance over her shoulder, she watched for a moment, as James tried his best to calm down his sister, despite the fact that his eyes still had that look to them that made it seem like he could possibly explode at any moment now. She released a quick breath through her nose and quietly nodded into herself. She needed to remind herself that she wasn't the only one who wanted to get things done here, even if it felt like they were always just waiting to her. They all felt that way. They just needed to have it under control. And once things had started to move, they were moving. Now that she had scolded herself, she'd have realized that there was absolutely no need for her to hurry things along, as the entire group moved smoothly as a unit, without any hiccups or hold-ups holding them back. As they traversed the corridor, they soon left the still relatively untouched part that was right in front of their own doors, where the walls were still covered in the now quite sooty but still very much intact fabric, behind, and entered an area where the splashing sound of the wet carpet was replaced by the wet crunching of slime mixed with fine ashes. Where the walls were charred so black that they threatened to swallow up the light that came from the dim lamps above, they couldn't shine as brightly anymore, since their glass had also been covered with a layer of soot after the fire had climbed all the way to the ceiling. It seemed they had found where the fire had truly raged, as they slowly traversed the now dripping aftermath of the inferno. And all the way on the other side of it lay their destination of Moore's and Conglorch's room. She'd bit the inside of her cheek. The closer they were getting to it, the anticipation was building up in her chest. She just really hoped the old lady was alright. Sure, Avesalon's timely rescue hadn't come long after she had last heard the Raphaelite's voice, but she had already sounded so weak. And even as she walked, she'd still felt the cold that had now replaced the heat gripping at her bones and gnawing at her limbs. Please just be alright, she thought quietly, while she tried her best not to actually bite herself bloody, as her jaws really wanted to clench tightly, no matter how much cheek flesh would be in the way of that. Although it was very much against both protocol and her orders, she couldn't quite help but glance over her shoulder more and more as they gradually moved in on the door, not able to hold her nervousness at bay, as she simply had to see what was waiting for them there. And that way, she also didn't miss how, when the leading part of their formation was still a few measures away from the door, it already opened before any of them could have even thought about reaching it. Behind it, it revealed two giant familiar forms in a very unfamiliar situation. Moore stood hunched over, leaning dangerously far forwards as her head was barely held up, definitely looking like she would have tipped over immediately had it not been for one of her long, spindly arms that was tightly slung around Conglorch's back and shoulder. The Tenaciousite held the old woman's wrist gripped tightly, as he pulled her arm firmly around himself to hold her up, even as he himself moved rather uncharacteristically slow and sluggish right now. Moore's other arm hung limply down at her side, just like her long wet fur that had matted together into thick, clumped locks from the viscous fluid that it was drenched in, now looking like a bunch of tiny anchors that were trying their very best to weigh the elderly lady down and pull her to the ground. If only it wasn't for the meddling reptile keeping her on her feet. Even Moore's eyes were covered by thick lumps of fur, and it seemed like she didn't even have the energy to remove them so she could see. All she seemed to be capable of at that moment was to walk along next to the person dragging her on complete autopilot, just going as long as her weak legs would carry her. Sheeta's heart sank at the depressing sight, even if she still breathed a bit lighter now that she saw that Moore seemed to hopefully be in no lethal condition at least, even if she would still clearly need medical attention as soon as at all possible. Meanwhile, Conglorch's eyes wildly spun around as they scanned the corridor for all the things that the humans had also scouted for as they stepped out, though obviously they soon landed on the humans. And, after scanning over the formation, all four of them soon landed on James specifically. "This is going to have consequences, Dancer," he addressed the human between heavy breaths. Still, despite the clear fatigue that the lizard was showing, there was a deep, biting severity to his voice that made a shudder go down Sheeta's back that had nothing to do with the cold for once. Out of Conglorch's mouth, rode with dagger-like teeth, the sentence almost sounded like a threat as he glared down at James, with his eyes filled with intensity. But all of them knew that the consequences the giant was referring to would not be coming from him. What James had ordered and or allowed, depending on your definition, this night had broken a staggering amount of galactic laws, as well as promises that both he and Veselon had made to the galaxy, even if it had saved lives. Telling a realized to invade a presumably protected system uninvited, for no matter what reason, it was basically akin to high treason. And yet, despite that, James managed to fight his obviously still boiling feelings back enough to give the Lisator a firm nod. "I know, and I'll take full responsibility," he confirmed, before beginning to gesture for the man to come closer, so he and the barely conscious Moore could join up in the formation, and they could make sure everyone would get the help that they needed. Conglorch released a long, deep exhale as he began to move once more. And again, Sheeda noticed the slow sluggishness of his movements, as each step he took seemed to truly drag on and take a lot out of the man. For a moment, she wondered what had hit him so hard, but then her eyes caught the twinkle of the wet sheen that was covering the heavy plating, which protected his massive body. He is cold too, she realized, as Conglorch continued to drag more over to the group step by exhausting step. And of course, the Raphaelite wasn't faring any better, only being able to take the tiniest, most minuscule steps of her large feet to try and keep up with the Tenastrocyte. There would most certainly be no rushing things anymore. The humans nervously glanced around at each other as they waited for the giants to pass just the few measures that separated them from the rest of the group. Clearly, they were internally preparing for this to possibly make things more complicated down the line. But they would all just have to deal with it. They needed to get more out of here. Now. "It looks like Alexander's hackers aren't all that they're cracked up to be after all," Eskfotarra commented, as he took shelter from the hailing of thick liquid underneath a comically oversized table that was placed in one of the hotel's corridors. Around him, his soldiers were huddled up, waiting for the constant rain of slime to subside, as they sat out the automated system's extinguishing measures. But maybe theirs are just better," Miraxra threw out there, clearly figuring that the systems had not managed to kick out the manipulating forces all by themselves, and had instead been reactivated by another party altogether here. Eskfotarra scoffed and gritted his teeth slightly as he thought about that. "You think Veselon broke this wide open?" he asked, although in reality he was more wondering aloud than actually expecting an answer. His ears lowered slightly, as the implications of all that chased each other through his mind. "That idea is rather disconcerting." Hopefully, Dunamo wouldn't be pulled into even deeper shit than it was in already because of those damn primates who couldn't leave well enough alone. His home had already been attacked once when people tried to get to a Veselon. If she was really reaching out and no longer confining herself to just one world now, well, he just hoped people would be willing to see reason once Aldwyn was gone. "Either way, they're certainly not making things easy," he grumbled, instead of allowing himself to be pulled deeper into that line of thought, as he watched the blotches continue to rain down. "At least nobody should get in the way this time." Next to him, he could hear a tired exhale. Guess I still can't convince you to back off?" Miraxra asked after a moment of silence, which in turn caused Eskfotarra to sigh as well, though it quickly turned into a groan for him as he snapped around. "No," he said, his ears folding back as he glared at Miraxra imperiously. "We can't just let him get away. Just look what he's done to you." Miraxra's ears hung slightly as he looked back at him, his eyes closing slightly as he seemed saddened, more so than intimidated by the display. "Yeah," he then said with another sigh, and shook his head slowly, his twitch making itself noticeable in the movement. "I remember. Weird that you're the one mad about it, though." Anger sparking within him at the snide remark, Eskfotarra released an aggressive exhale through his nose, and tore his gaze away with a grimace. Good thing that the sprinkler's rain seemed to be subsiding gradually now. "Get ready to move," Eskfotarra ordered his team sternly, and began to wait for them to follow him, as he impatiently waited for the last bit of slime to hail down before they could finally be on their way. Even if the fire was out, Aldwyn would be on a silver platter here, and he wouldn't waste that chance. Sneaking along with all their feline grace, the soldiers soon traversed the slightly torched hallways, their weapons lifted and their ears open. As they closed in on the stairway, they would finally take them to the proper floor to settle this score once and for all. Although, by now, this was about far more than just an old debt that needed to be paid. At the rate Allwyn was moving right now, there was a good chance that they were doing the galaxy a favour by stopping him, before he would step over a line there would be no going back from. Clearly, if it meant benefiting his own interests, there were few things that remained holy to that saint. Their process slowed a bit, as they encroached on the stairs, fully aware that they didn't exactly know their foe's movements, meaning that it wasn't impossible that contact would happen right there in the stairwell. Of course, that was far from ideal, but they would be ready for it. With their weapons aimed high and the order to fire at will, Eskfotarra had led his soldiers into the ascending spiral. His ears twitched as he listened out for the sound of echoing footsteps, and quickly, he signaled to his team that, from this point onward, silence was the way to go. They couldn't afford to be heard before they would hear them, and voices carried far, especially in barren places like this. They had the advantage when it came to hearing. They shouldn't waste it. Luckily, so far it seemed like the stairwell was still empty, though that was also slightly strange. He wondered what was keeping them, but he couldn't get hung up on that. Slowly he ascended the stairs, leading from the front as he was first in line to get to take the shot. With the levels of the building being as tall as they were, it took quite a bit of walking just to ascend from one to another, but still, although the stairs seemed to drag on forever as he was traversing them, it was like he didn't even know a moment had passed when he was already at the cusp of their apex, staring at the exit that would lead into the fateful corridor. He needed to be quick. He knew that. Against his will, Alexander's words echoed in his head. "He'll easily kill you." Yeah, what a load of BS that had turned out to be. After all, the only reason Allwyn was even still walking around right now was because Eskfotarra had refused to take the shot while children were watching. A single chance he had given away for a nobler reason. However, this time, the human would not be so lucky. And yet still, those words echoed in the back of his mind, almost as if something in his brain was trying to tell him that things were different this time. Obviously, it was just his nerves playing tricks on him. Still, the tricks did their job in unnerving him. He would have to be quick. These people were good. He couldn't forget that. One step closer to the fork in the road, and once he reached it, he had to be fast. He exhaled deeply. Then, a smirk crept onto his face. He was fast. And he could hear them. His ears wide open, he knew exactly where they were. He could hear their wet steps. He could hear the lumbering giants. They were sitting ducks. He would just have to hit the right one. One last moment to still his nerves. One deep breath. Then, he pushed himself beyond the threshold, his eyes wide open, as he had to take in the entire hallway within a heartbeat. His weapon was up, and he looked past its barrel as his gaze darted around between all the sources of sloppy footsteps. There were the giants, catching his attention for a fraction of a second with their enormous forms, but ultimately being quickly dismissed as they were of no concern. He had to be quick. His eyes darted to another form in the front. Tall, dark hair. Not tall enough, though, and skin too dark. That wasn't him. Next, his eyes briefly glided over the Miat. She seemed to be distracted. Hadn't noticed him. Where was she looking? There! He could feel his pupils constrict into tiny dots, as they had finally found their target, his arms adjusting the aim of his rifle by only a few hundredths of a measure, training it straight onto that pale, almost ghostly visage. Then he pulled the trigger. Suddenly, he felt a burning pain as something imperceptibly fast whipped past his ear, barely touching him, but still seeming to pull his entire head around with the sheer force it transferred from just that minimal contact. An almost unnoticeably short moment later, a near-piercing sound erupted. It was just a moment too late when Eskfotarra realized that was wrong. A near-piercing sound didn't erupt. it had erupted. However, it had taken a bit to catch up to its source, and that along left the waves of sound behind it. And the sound wasn't the only thing that had taken a bit to catch up to the projectile, because so had the pain. Only as he was already grabbed from behind and swiftly pulled back behind a covering wall, did he realize that he had been hit much earlier than he himself had realized, and that therefore his aim had been off. They had reacted so quickly? As he was pulled back into cover, his ears rang from the pain and the noise. A constant ringing filled up his world. But even through that, he could hear a painful outcry come from the corridor he had just whiffed his shot into. The voice was high, but he couldn't exactly tell which of the humans had made the noise. All he knew was that it wasn't his target. Slightly shell-shocked, Eskfotarra leaned against the wall he had been pulled behind, not really hearing what his soldiers were saying to him, as they seemed to be incessantly asking something. A drizzle of blood was flowing down the side of his face, and there was a sharp stinging pain whenever he moved his ear. Seemed like he hadn't gotten out of the exchange unscathed. And with his ears ringing as they were, he couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. Still, he was sure they were on the move. Someone who reacted so fast wouldn't sit idly after being shot at. This would make things harder. He had missed. He would have to finish the job. The only question was how. There was no way he could peek his head around that corner again. It would be taken off in an instant. Still not hearing a thing his soldiers were saying, Eskfotarra leaned his head against the covering wall for a moment, trying to strategize a plan of attack here. However, before he could truly get his brain going, his eyes suddenly caught the sight of light, as a hole suddenly appeared just over his head, slightly illuminated the stairwell. His brain got caught up on the strange phenomenon, but only for the few microseconds, or maybe less than that, it took for the sound to once again catch up to the shot, as another bang drilled into his ear canals, while he was momentarily showered with debris. They had just fired at the wall? And it didn't stay at one shot either. Hole after hole suddenly appeared in the wall, as more and more parts were ripped out of it by unfathomably fast projectiles that came one after another. With his instincts kicking in, Eskfotarra grabbed the soldiers closest to him, as he started to drag them down away from the wall, away from the line of fire, as shot after shot came for them, with seemingly no plan behind it but to spray and pray. His movements were so sudden and uncoordinated that there was a good chance he would tumble down the stairs along with the men he had grabbed, but they were still better than staying within the range of that weapon. His ears were ringing more than ever now that more shots had been fired, explosion after explosion tearing his hearing to shreds. But still, there was one thing he could still hear, even through it all. Just as much as he had been sure that the yelp of pain hadn't been Alduin's voice when he had heard it earlier, he was now sure that it was very much the primate saint's voice, when an almost animalistic scream came echoing through the barren halls, every syllable of the promise dripping with animus. "You're dead!"